This is the Bible Book Club. I'm Heather.
And I'm Susan.
And we're in the book of 1 Kings. Welcome to the club. Last time, on chapters 3 and 4 of 1 Kings, we began a focus on Solomon's reign as king. The first thing Solomon did was very wise. He asked God for a discerning heart to help the people distinguish between right and wrong. God was pleased with this request. He granted Solomon's desire, and he even added to it. God said that Solomon would be both wise and wealthy. And if he walked with the Lord, he would live long. In the next scene, Solomon's wisdom was tested by two women who both claimed to be the mother of the same baby. Solomon prepared to cut the baby in two so they could each have a half. The real mom then begged to spare the child, proving that she was the mother. With this trick, Solomon's wisdom became legend throughout the entire world.
Okay, so here's our setup for this episode. Going back to 2 Samuel 7:12, remember what God promised. Listen.
When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever.
The time has come for Solomon to build. This was a historic occasion for the Israelites for several reasons. First and foremost, the temple was built to house the ark. The ark was the seat of God's presence. It was also the place of atonement for their sins. Atonement was crucial for their relationship with God. The Canaanites, Egyptians, etc., all those people, all had temples for their God. The ark, this great seat and place for God's presence, had been housed in a tent called the tabernacle from the time they left Egypt to well after the time they wandered in the wilderness. At this present time that we're in, the ark is housed in some tent that David pitched for it in 2 Samuel 6:17. So the ark has just been homeless. It needs a permanent home. It needed a temple. So the temple would be the focal point for Israel's worship and religious life. And the temple would give Israel a national identity like all the other countries that had temples for their gods. In scene 1, Solomon prepares to build this temple.
Chapter 5. When Hiram, king of Tyre, heard that Solomon had been anointed king to succeed his father David, he sent his envoys to Solomon because he had always been on friendly terms with David. Solomon sent back this message to Hiram. You know that because of the wars waged against my father David from all sides, he could not build a temple for the name of the Lord his God until the Lord put his enemies under his feet. But now the Lord my God has given me rest on every side, and there is no adversary or disaster. I intend, therefore, to build a temple for the name of the Lord my God, as the Lord told my father David when he said, your son, whom I will put on the throne in your place, will build the temple for my name. So, give orders that cedars of Lebanon be cut for me. My men will work with yours, and I will pay you for your men whatever wages you set. You know that we have no one so skilled in felling timber as the Sidonians. When Hiram heard Solomon's message, he was greatly pleased and said, praise be to the Lord today, for he has given David a wise son to rule over this great nation. So Hiram sent word to Solomon, I have received the message you sent me and will do all you want in providing the cedar and juniper logs. My men will haul them down from Lebanon to the Mediterranean Sea, and I will float them as rafts by sea to the place you specify. There I will separate them, and you can take them away, and you are to grant my wish by providing food for my royal household. In this way, Hiram kept Solomon supplied with all the cedar and juniper logs he wanted, and Solomon gave Hiram 20,000 cores of wheat as food for his household, in addition to 20,000 baths of pressed olive oil. Solomon continued to do this for Hiram year after year. The Lord gave Solomon wisdom, just as he had promised him. There were peaceful relations between Hiram and Solomon, and the two of them made a treaty.
So the first thing that Solomon did was to negotiate for resources with the king of Tyre. Hiram, the king of Tyre, was a former ally of David's. So Hiram sent an envoy to Solomon, clearly hoping to be allies with David's son also. This was providential. or divine opportunity for Solomon. Israel did not have the resources or the expertise to build what Solomon had in mind for the temple, but Tyre did. They had provided building materials to David in the past in 2 Samuel 5:11,
which states, "Now Hiram, king of Tyre, sent envoys to David along with cedar logs and carpenters and stonemasons, and they built a palace for David."
Solomon begins negotiations for similar assistance by reminding Hiram of God's instructions to David that Solomon should be the one to build. Hiram was so pleased with Solomon's request that he even praised God. The collaboration was simple. Solomon and Hiram negotiated a lifetime supply of wheat and olive oil in exchange for Tyre's lumber and skilled labor.
Now back to our story in 1 Kings chapter 5, continuing in verse 13. King Solomon conscripted laborers from all Israel, 30,000 men. He sent them off to Lebanon in shifts of 10,000 a month, so that they spent 1 month in Lebanon and 2 months at home. Adoniram was in charge of the forced labor. Solomon had 70,000 carriers and 80,000 stonecutters in the hills, as well as 3,300 foremen who supervised the project and directed the workers. At the king's command, they removed from the quarry large blocks of high-grade stone to provide a foundation of dressed stone for the temple. The craftsmen of Solomon and Hiram and workers from Byblos cut and prepared the timber and stone for the building of the temple.
Then the next task on Solomon's list was to organize the construction team for building. Adoniram would be the man in charge. 30,000 men were enlisted from all of Israel. 10,000 of those 30,000 rotated in each month, while the other 20,000 spent 2 months at home. It sounds like a simple job share plan. However, they have no planes and cars. And that commute every 3 months must have been killer for some of them. Not to mention housing and feeding 10,000 migrant workers every month. On top of the Israelite labor, there were 70,000 carriers who transported the stone from Phoenicia, 80,000 stone cutters, 3,300 foremen to keep all of the men organized, and then the craftsmen who did the more elaborate work on the timber and stone. Over 187,000 men worked on the project. Sometimes wisdom is not being a genius. It is the undaunted determination to get things done. Solomon is on a mission and he is going to get it done. He will build God a home for his presence to dwell among them. What is your mission? What skill has God given you to accomplish his mission? Genius, determination, courage, vision, or influence? Are you getting it done? It's something to think about. Scene 2, Solomon builds the temple. Recall from 2 Samuel that the temple was built on the threshing floor purchased by David located on Mount Moriah. Nothing is left to be seen of the temple. It's covered by the Dome of the Rock. But the spot is probably the most sacred and disputed real estate in the world. It is a holy place for Christians, Jews, and Muslims. So the rock on Mount Moriah is believed by Muslims, this is why I'm explaining why it's important to them, is believed to be the place from which the Prophet Muhammad ascended into heaven. It's the most famous and oldest Islamic site, and it's called actually the Dome of the Rock. The Dome of the Rock is a shrine that was completed in 692 and completely covers this rock that was the threshing floor. Muslims also consider Abraham a prophet. However, instead of Abraham sacrificing Isaac on this rock, as we discussed way back in Genesis, the Quran suggests that it was Ishmael who was the sacrificial son. So that's why the Muslims, have created the Dome of Rock on this rock. The Jews also regard the location of the stone inside the Dome of the Rock as the holiest spot on earth because it's where Isaac was almost sacrificed and it's the site of the Holy of Holies in Solomon's temple where the Ark of the Covenant sat. So Solomon is going to build on the same rock. Now, because Muslim authorities have refused to permit Jewish prayer on the Temple Mount, the Jews developed a custom of praying near the Western Wall because they can't pray where the temple was. Now, to Christians, the rock, formerly the temple, is sacred because it was where baby Jesus was presented in the temple. It's where Jesus was found among the teachers as a 12-year-old. It's where he prayed and taught and drove the money changers out of the temple precincts. It's where the veil was torn when Jesus died on the cross. The temple represents all that Jesus fought to give us access to without the never-ending constraints of sacrificing for atonement. So it's just a super, super important place. I'm going to put all the maps and the video tour of the Temple Mount back in the show notes. We have shared those before, but my favorite is this video tour that these two people got permission to do, because you really get to walk in and see. And then there's so much you can research. There's so much archaeology that was done like in the 50s and 60s. Nothing has been done recently because no one's allowed to, but it's a great rabbit hole to go down.
Oh, yeah. So I don't always go to the show notes, but I'm going to have to go to that one because I want to see that video.
Oh, yeah. It's really good. It's for someone like me who hasn't been to Israel yet. I just loved that they kind of got permission to go in, and they were as excited as you will probably be watching it, because they're like, I can't believe they let us do this, you know?
If you're looking for the show notes, just scroll down in the episode wherever you're watching, and there will be links right there, and you just click them and it'll take you straight to the video that Susan's talking about.
Correct. Okay. The temple compared to the tabernacle. Let's talk about this. I'm also going to put in the show notes a drawing of the tabernacle that we've shared in the past, and a drawing of this temple we're about to describe. So you can compare them, because they're a footprint. It's a footprint. The temple is a footprint of the tabernacle. All right, starting in chapter 6.
In the 480th year after the Israelites came out of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, the 2nd month, he began to build the temple of the Lord.
So the word Ziv means flowers. So the temple building began in the month of flowers, which is somewhere between April and May. It was the 2nd month of the year, 480 years after God brought Israel out of Egypt, which was in Exodus 12:40. Listen.
Now, the length of time the Israelite people lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of the 430 years, to the very day, all the Lord's divisions left Egypt.
So the authors of the Bible often give us dates, and we just kind of skip over them, but they usually are trying to make a point. And in this case, the author is comparing this important date, the starting of the temple, to the important date the Israelites left Egypt. After 430 years in Egypt, Israel was given their freedom. And after 480 years of wandering and war, Israel was given rest. It's a big moment for them. Now, when God created the Davidic covenant in 2 Samuel, this is what he promised. Listen.
2 Samuel 7, starting in verse 10. And I will provide a place for my people Israel, and will plant them so that they can have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed. Wicked people will not oppress them anymore, as they did at the beginning, and have done ever since the time I appointed leaders over my people Israel. I will also give you rest from all your enemies. The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever.
The author of Kings sees the beginning of the temple construction as the beginning of the promised era of rest. This is another sign to them, another promise fulfilled in a long line of promises. Israel is on the right path in God's redemption plan.
Now back to our story in 1 Kings chapter 6, continuing in verse 2. The temple that King Solomon built for the Lord was 60 cubits long, 20 wide, and 30 high. The portico at the front of the main hall of the temple extended the width of the temple, that is, 20 cubits, and projected 10 cubits from the front of the temple. He made narrow windows high up in the temple walls. Against the walls of the main hall and inner sanctuary, he built a structure around the building in which there were side rooms. The lowest floor was 5 cubits wide, the middle floor 6 cubits, and the third floor 7. He made offset ledges around the outside of the temple so that nothing would be inserted into the temple walls. In building the temple, only blocks dressed at the quarry were used, and no hammer, chisel, or any other iron tool was heard at the temple site while it was being built. The entrance to the lowest floor was on the south side of the temple. A stairway led up to the middle level, and from there to the third. So he built the temple and completed it, roofing it with beams and planks. And he built side rooms all along the temple. The height of each was 5 cubits, and they were attached to the temple by beams of cedar.
Okay, so this is a little hard to follow, but don't worry, we're putting a diagram in the show notes if you really want to track. The exterior, interior, entrances, and courtyards is what I'm going to now try to explain to you. The exterior measured approximately 90 feet long by 30 feet wide and 45 feet high. It's very kind of even numbers because guess what? They're going to break it up. The temple size was double the size of the tabernacle. The front porch then added another 10 cubits, which would have been about 15 feet. Around the 3 other walls of the exterior, there were 3 stories of side rooms that were built, but it's kind of cool the way they did it. They didn't really attach it to the temple. So no like nailing was going on to the temple. They were kind of supported by ledges. The temple was a small building compared to the others that Solomon's about to build. So it was a specific size for a reason. However, it was a part of a much larger royal compound and the adjacent palace, which I'm going to get into next episode. So the interior included a long and narrow main hall or holy place, which would have been 30 wide by 60. And then the inner sanctuary at the end of that main hall, where the ark was going to sit, was called the most holy place or the Holy of Holies. The entrance to the sanctuary was through the front porch. So there would have been the front porch, then this long main hall, and then this most holy place, the Holy of Holies at the end.
And if it was just to store the tabernacle, what were all the rooms for? Like, what are they going to do with those rooms? Is like meeting rooms or something?
The ones on the outside, they thought that they stored some things there. I don't know what they stored, but my guess would be if they, like all the grain and the sacrifice stuff, who knows? They had a lot of, I don't know, meeting rooms? Who knows? I don't know. So the entrance to the sanctuary was through the front porch. The entrance to the side rooms and stairs were on the south side of the temple.
Continuing in 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 11, the word of the Lord came to Solomon. As for this temple you are building, if you follow my decrees, observe my laws, and keep all my commands and obey them, I will fulfill through you the promise I gave to David your father, and I will live among the Israelites and will not abandon my people Israel.
So the Lord reminds Solomon of his promise right after Solomon completed the exterior, but before he began the interior, he received a very important spiritual memorandum straight from the Lord. Remember, this house you are building for me is a place for me to dwell among my people as long as my people keep my laws as outlined in the Mosaic covenant. And if they keep my laws, I will keep my covenant to David as outlined in the Davidic covenant. In other words, as beautiful as this temple will be, our relationship is not about a house. It cannot hold me captive in a relationship with Israel. Israel must have a heart for the Lord, or this house for the Lord will fall.
Spoiler alert, it starts out great and then goes downhill fast. Verse 14, so Solomon built the temple and completed it. He lined its interior walls with cedar boards, paneling them from the floor of the temple to the ceiling, and covered the floor of the temple with planks of juniper. He partitioned off 20 cubits at the rear of the temple with cedar boards from floor to ceiling to form within the temple an inner sanctuary, the most holy place. The main hall in front of this room was 40 cubits long. The inside of the temple was cedar, carved with gourds and open flowers. Everything was cedar. No stone was to be seen.
They're very proud of that cedar. And that's for a reason. So this is the temple interior we're talking about now. The kings of Egypt, Phoenicia, Assyria, Babylon, and Persia all used cedar trees to build temples and palaces. So, they're proud of their cedar. And Solomon paneled the walls of Israel's temple with carved cedar. The cedar tree was ideal because of its size. It reached up to 100 feet tall, and it was very fragrant. So it had a good smell too.
Isn't it also like a really, don't they put things in cedar chests to preserve them?
Well, because moths won't get them. I guess it keeps the moths away. That's what my grandmother used to say.
Yeah. All right, verse 19. He prepared the inner sanctuary within the temple to set the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord there. The inner sanctuary was 20 cubits long, 20 wide and 20 high. He overlaid the inside with pure gold, and he also overlaid the altar of cedar. Solomon covered the inside of the temple with pure gold, and he extended gold chains across the front of the inner sanctuary, which was overlaid with gold. So he overlaid the whole interior with gold. He also overlaid with gold the altar that belonged to the inner sanctuary. For the inner sanctuary, he made a pair of cherubim out of olive wood, each 10 cubits high. One wing of the first cherub was 5 cubits long, and the other wing 5 cubits, 10 cubits from wingtip to wingtip. The second cherub also measured 10 cubits, for the 2 cherubim were identical in size and shape. The height of each cherub was 10 cubits. He placed the cherubim inside the innermost room of the temple, with their wings spread out. The wing of one cherub touched one wall, while the wing of the other touched the other wall, and their wings touched each other in the middle of the room. He overlaid the cherubim with gold.
Okay, so this is the description explanation for the inner sanctuary, or the most holy place. It's kind of cool. This was the most important part of the temple. It was where the Ark of the Covenant would sit. And it was a perfect cube in dimensions, 20 cubits square. Now, it was a golden cube, the walls, floor, and ceiling all overlaid with gold. A biblical cubit was about 1.5 feet. In other ancient cultures, it was longer, but for them, it was 1.5 feet. So the most holy place took up the entire last third of the temple, or 30 feet square. The first 2/3, remember, or 60 feet, was the main hall, or holy place. Now, possibly this room, the main hall, was also gold, because in verse 22, it seems to be included with the most holy place. So there is a lot of gold inside. Now, let's talk about these 2 cherubim, because I've always tried to picture this in my head. Inside the most holy place were 15-foot high cherubim with wings that touched in the middle and expanded the width of the room. So remember, the room is 30 feet wide. And so these 2 cherubim are side by side touching. They cover the whole wall, width of the room. Now, in the drawing we have in the show notes, you'll see that the cherubim most likely stood straight behind or right over the ark with their wings kind of over it. And remember, there's cherubim on the ark too.
I was going to ask about that. Yeah. I kind of remembered that, but I didn't remember how big they are. Obviously smaller, because they've got to fit inside this room.
No, Solomon just supersizes everything. That was his plan.
It in gold.
And covers it in gold. So the gold altar was the altar of incense, and it would have been placed near the entrance to the most holy place in the main hall. So, you walk into the holy place, which is the main hall, and at the end, before the cube, there would have been the altar of incense. The altar of incense was also in the tabernacle, and it's described in more detail there. So that's in Exodus 30. Listen to what this was made of.
Make an altar of acacia wood for burning incense. It is to be square, a cubit long and a cubit wide, and 2 cubits high, its horns of one piece with it. Overlay the top and all the sides and the horns with pure gold, and make a gold molding around it. Make 2 gold rings for the altar below the molding, 2 on each of the opposite sides to hold the poles used to carry it. Make the poles of acacia wood and overlay them with gold. Put the altar in front of the curtain that shields the Ark of the Covenant law, before the atonement cover that is over the tablets of the covenant law, where I will meet with you. Aaron must burn fragrant incense on the altar every morning when he tends the lamps. He must burn incense again when he lights the lamps at twilight, so incense will burn regularly before the Lord for the generations to come.
Okay, so that's a description of the tabernacle altar of incense. We don't know what it looked like for Solomon, but the purpose of it was the same, to burn this fragrant incense that would be lit every morning and night by the high priest. In this case, it was Aaron. So there was an altar of incense in the tabernacle, and now Solomon places an altar of incense in the temple. And check this out. In Revelation 8, the Apostle John has a vision of an altar of incense in heaven.
Revelation 8:1. When he opened the 7th seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. And I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and 7 trumpets were given to them. Another angel, who had a golden censer, came and stood at the altar. He was given much incense to offer with the prayers of all God's people on the golden altar in front of the throne. The smoke of the incense, together with the prayers of God's people, went up before God from the angel's hand. Then the angel took the censer, filled it with fire from the altar, and hurled it on the earth. And there came peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake.
Okay, so anytime I find a link to Revelations, it's a Bible bender for me. So when I find a commentary on Revelations that is super clear in explaining a Revelations passage, I want to share it with you. So I'm going to read verbatim the pulpit commentary's explanation of what John saw in this vision in Revelations, because it ties back to where we are right now. This is what he said. This is the golden altar of incense, which stood before the veil in Exodus 30:6 and in 1 Kings 6, but which now stands before the throne of God, the veil having disappeared. The order of events followed resembles the ceremony of Jewish worship. In the temple, the priest took burning coals from off the bronze altar in the courtyard and proceeded to the altar of incense on which to burn incense. The prayers are to be incensed so as to render them pure and acceptable to God upon the golden altar. There appears to be a kind of progression in the insight that the seer, John is the seer in this case, affords us of the heavenly worship. In Revelations 4:1, a door is opened and St. John sees into heaven. He is, as it were, outside the sanctuary, the heavenly sanctuary. In this place, he is permitted to advance in his vision within the sanctuary and to observe the golden altar. Hence, there's going to be an altar of incense in heaven, and somehow we are going to be able to incense prayers. I don't know. It's so fascinating. So I love how the gold altar of incense starts in the tabernacle, progresses to the temple, and ends before the throne of God in heaven. The tabernacle was the first dwelling place of the presence of God on earth. The temple was the second dwelling place of the presence of God on earth. And heaven is the last dwelling place of man in the presence of God. The progression of the altar of incense from Exodus to 1 Kings to Revelations is a small example of how God has led us through his plan of redemption to our final resting place in the new heaven and new earth. For us to dwell in relationship with him for eternity has been his goal since the beginning. Okay. The gold chains that were extended across the inner sanctuary most likely referred to the veil that separated the ark from the view of all but the high priest. So the veil, there's a door. We're going to get to a description of the door. In between the holy place and the most holy place, there's doors, but there also is this veil. The veil was either in front of the door or behind the door, but it served a great purpose because nobody could see it.
Only the priests go in there, right?
Correct.
And then common people are allowed to go into the tabernacle or no?
No.
Not common people.
Common people could go into the courtyard, which, remember, we're going to get to the bronze altar that sits there. But only the certain priests could go into the holy place, and then only the high priest could go into the most holy place.
Okay, so this beauty and all these beautiful cherubim extending across that
nobody
only
sees.
Get to see.
Yes. It's crazy. I know, nobody sees. But think about it. If the veil is there, so if you open a door and somebody happened to be in the holy place, which that never happened because they were careful, or they die, but you still couldn't see the ark because there'd be that veil there.
Yeah.
Or if the veil was in front of the door, you'd step behind the veil and then open the door. Either way, nobody's seeing that ark but the high priest. Now listen to this. In 2 Corinthians, Paul spoke about the veil. His words explain the believer's access to God's glory. It's really cool. Go ahead.
2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 13. We are not like Moses, who would put a veil over his face to prevent the Israelites from seeing the end of what was passing away. But their minds were made dull, for to this day the same veil remains when the old covenant is read. It has not been removed, because only in Christ is it taken away. Even to this day, when Moses is read, a veil covers their hearts. But whenever anyone turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And we all, who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory, are being transformed into His image with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit.
I love how there's another imagery of a veil here. So there's a veil in the temple, and there's a veil that covered Moses' face. And both of these are examples of our separation from God. We can't look on the Ark of the Covenant. We're separated from that. We cannot look on anyone who's got the glory of God's glory on their face, Moses. And so this veil is removed, Paul is saying, and Jesus died for our sin. The veil in the temple was ripped into. Our sins have been atoned for, and now we have access to God through Jesus Christ. So we can see His glory. We can approach Him. We can approach the throne without fear that we will die.
Now back to our story in 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 29. On the walls, all around the temple, in both the inner and outer rooms, he carved cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers. He also covered the floors of both the inner and outer rooms of the temple with gold. For the entrance to the inner sanctuary, he made doors out of olive wood that were 1/5 of the width of the sanctuary. And on the 2 olive wood doors, he carved cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers, and overlaid the cherubim and palm trees with hammered gold. In the same way, for the entrance to the main hall, he made door frames out of olive wood that were 1/4 of the width of the hall. He also made 2 doors out of juniper wood, each having 2 leaves that turned in sockets. He carved cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers on them, and overlaid them with gold, hammered evenly over the carvings. And he built the inner courtyard of 3 courses of dressed stone and 1 course of trimmed cedar beams.
All right, the walls and doors and inner court is what they covered next, the author covered next. The walls and doors of the temple were elaborately carved with cherubim, palm trees, and flowers. And this all was supposed to represent the Garden of Eden. And then, of course, there's more gold. The author wants us to understand that everything was covered with gold, even the floor. Now, the doors to the temple and the most holy place are similarly carved and covered in hammered gold. The inner court, also called the court of the priests, was a walled-in space around the outside of the temple. No gold.
Continuing in verse 37, the foundation of the temple of the Lord was laid in the 4th year in the month of Ziv. In the 11th year in the month of Bul, the 8th month, the temple was finished in all its details according to its specifications. He had spent 7 years building it.
So Solomon completes the temple, at least the exterior. In the 8th month, the month of Bul, which means rain, the temple took 7.5 years to complete, and God finally had a place to dwell among them, but He's not moving in yet. Solomon and the Israelites built the temple for God, but would God come? And if He did, would God stay? Stay tuned for episode 5 and 6 when our old friend the cloud makes another appearance.
What's a club without friends? If you're enjoying the Bible Book Club, why don't you share it? And then you can say, Welcome to the club. New episodes drop every Monday, and get all episodes now on Amazon Music. As always, head over to susanme.com/Bible Book Club for show notes from today's episode. Bible Book Club is hosted by Susan Merrill and Heather Rubio, edited by Buck Buchanan, produced by Haley Mawat.